Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Kyle Naranya, and welcome to episode 174. And on this week's episode of the podcast, I am reviewing one of my most anticipated films of the year. That is the conclusion to the duology that is Wicked for Good. As this is a feature film review, there will be a non-spoiler section as well as a spoiler section. Time codes will be listed in the description, so no need to worry if you are one of the few musical theater fans who did not get out to the theater this weekend. Let's not waste any time. Let's return to Oz with Wicked for Good review.
Elva Withrop, I know you're out here. Just come in before the monkeys spot you.
If you somehow missed my Wicked review, I have never seen the musical, I've never read the book, I've seen The Wizard of Oz. I judged Wicked based on being a film. That is what my Wicked for Good review is going to be based on. And I wanted to address the first sentiment that I've seen, which I find incredibly interesting. I am a musical theater fan. I have not seen as many shows on the stage as I would like, and if I can, I will typically see the musical adaptations when they make it to the silver screen. Now, what's compelling to me about Wicked for Good was it was a continuation on a movie I really loved from last year, and I was curious to see how this was going to wrap up, how this was going to weave in and out of The Wizard of Oz. That is a known aspect of Act 2. And it's very funny to me that the sentiment regarding Act 2 is pretty consistent when you talk to musical theater fans. It's not as good as Act 1, and it's kind of messy. And that's the best description for Wicked for Good. This movie is kind of a mess. It doesn't have nearly as memorable musical sequences. There's maybe one or two songs that I think stand up to the best that Act 1 had to offer. I found it really frustrating, and some of this is very interesting to talk about, but I'm just going to be focusing on the movie as if nobody has seen the stage play or listened to the books, or read them, or Wizard of Oz is on the table, so I think that's totally fair. And it's unfortunate because the pacing for this movie is really poor. The movie's just over 2 hours, at 2 hours and 17 minutes, and the movie really does struggle with being part 2 of a story. There's something where there's such a high wire act in doing this with movies. Books have been split up famously. All of the YA final films were two-parters that broke up novels into those two pieces. The only one that I would say successfully did it, and I know this is completely biased because I'm a fan of that franchise, was Harry Potter. Deathly Hallows just continues from where we left off at the end of Deathly Hallows Part 1. And this movie's beginning really feels like it takes forever to get started. It's such an problematic thing in this movie where you could not have condensed this story successfully into a 3-hour movie. I just don't think it would have worked. And that is abundantly clear when you get to the latter half of the movie, which is the perspective on the Wizard of Oz. This is not a spoiler. We've seen it in the trailer. And again, I know there are probably musical theater fans who go, Kyle, a lot of this is duh. The musical is 20 years old. I respect your opinion if you've seen the musical. I have not, so I have to look at this purely as a film. And this movie is all over the place, and it really does struggle to settle in on so many things that are established in Act 1. I found that incredibly fascinating, that certain character arcs and foreshadowing and a lot of where their plot is going to go, the narrative around that character's social emotional state, is really set up effectively in Wicked 1. And then in Wicked for 2, some of those are handled incredibly well, and I think the tragedy of those characters really does manage to capture the downfall of these relationships. Well, one in particular that I'll get to in spoilers, and yes, it is a spoiler in the movie. However, the way it's introduced in the film, I found incredibly confusing because the movie is forward with you and establishes a significant change to a specific character, but then treats you as if you're unaware with that. And that really does come down to the struggle in the writing with this movie. I know that Winnie Holtzman was involved, and she wrote some of the Wicked stuff. And I find it really fascinating that the movie, more than anything, seems beholden to the Broadway book. And I understand so much of this is treated not with kid gloves, but with such a reverence for the original. There are a lot of books I love that wouldn't work necessarily if you adapted them page by page, word by word. And what has shifted in this movie is incredibly troubling because you can affect a movie's pacing when you have something to base it off of, because you can make corrections. You can finalize character stories maybe earlier, or you can move certain plot reveals to earlier on in the movie so that they feel like they have a significance to the overall story and don't just feel like we've tied all our bows, all our loose ends are done, there's no need to worry about that. And the back and forth with the movie was really frustrating for me, because when we are getting behind the scenes on what was going on with the Wizard of Oz, with Elphaba and with Galinda and the wizard, as well as Michelle Yeoh's character, which was Madame Morrible, the Good Witch of the South or North. I can't remember which one she's supposed to be of. I'm fairly certain it's the South. That stuff is really compelling, and it allows the actors to do some really great things with their roles. Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande are fantastic. The chemistry between those two actors is what these movies have been sold on, and they have to work. If they don't, these movies fall apart. The whole selling point of Wicked in general was, hey, did you know there was a friendship between Galinda and Elphaba? She didn't have a name at that point, but they then gave her a name, and you need to sell it on those two characters and what The Wizard of Oz, the film and the story within Wicked for Good, how does that devolve their friendship? Are they able to save themselves from the political aftermath of the hatred campaign that the wizard enacts towards Elphaba as the villain of the Land of Oz, given all of the troubles they're having with their crops and the talking animals and certain plot threads that are just for no reason dropped? I think that's frustrating. I was talking to friends about musicals and how so often this is a thing, specifically within this era where second acts, more than anything, are reprises of music you know, and they struggle to have the same iconography as Act 1, and Wicked for Good does have that. There are parts of this movie that I absolutely adored. Outside of the two main leads, I think the cast is really great, but the transition of when we get to The Wizard of Oz is very stilted. The logistics of the movie happening at the same time that this is supposed to be happening works sometimes, and if you think about it too hard during specific instances, it doesn't line up. I do like the fact that it manages, for the most part, if you're not really paying attention and don't have a biblical awareness of The Wizard of Oz, it would work for you. The perspectives of these characters that were not the focus of the original book and the original movie are what is worth watching in this. And that stuff they really nailed. I think all of the groundwork in Wicked 1 is paid off mostly successfully here. And ultimately, that is kind of the point of this. Could you have whittled this down into an hour that's just The Wizard of Oz? I really don't think you could have. I would like to see what this experience is like watching them back to back. I did take my lovely wife to see this, and we had a conversation about familiarity with the first film going into this one. That could you shotgun these back to back, and does that affect the experience? And I don't feel that the movie even effectively manages to move the story forward quickly enough in Wicked for Good, where this doesn't feel like a part 2. It really does feel like a sequel where stuff happened in the middle. And that's especially frustrating because within the realm of a musical, stage, or screen, you are able to use songs to inform the audience and move things forward, as opposed to feeling like you have to reestablish all of the elements or where all the characters are from the last movie. I don't know if this comes down to it being a year apart. I don't know if it would have worked if we only had 7 months. I think these movies in particular really do work going into the US Thanksgiving week and then having the opportunity to be seen over the holiday weekend. But clearly the anticipation for this was incredibly high. Just looking at the box office for this opening weekend, it blew my mind that Wicked internationally grossed $76 million with a domestic gross of just a regular weekend of Friday, Saturday, Sunday, that it pulled in 150, adding up to $226 million, which is an incredible achievement. The opening weekend for Wicked Part 1 was 164 globally. So that's an increase of almost $60 million. So it's abundantly clear from audiences and from fans that there was anticipation for this. And it's interesting that looking at what fans have had to say and then referencing the Rotten Tomatoes score, which is not something I typically love to do, but it is worth noting because at the end of the day, fans pay for the movie. But most critics wound up in the, it's good, it's not great, with a 70% tomato rating, and then the audience popcorn-o-meter is at 95%. If you are a diehard fan of the musical, I am sure you are going to love seeing a musical you love adapted to the big screen. Unfortunately for me, as somebody who has to watch this and evaluate the product presented, I think it is kind of messy. And as this was one of my most anticipated movies of the year, I'm disappointed by that. I'm looking forward to, when I have time, hopefully over the holiday break, watching these back to back. And if it's a different experience, I'll definitely make sure to let you, the listener, know that my opinion has shifted. Or maybe I will like this movie even less after watching the first one and then immediately following it with the sequel. I wanted to love this. I think that is clear from my review. I was very excited for this, and it's disappointing that so much of what I loved about Wicked Part 1 really wasn't reflected in Wicked for Good. That will do it for non-spoilers. Let's jump into spoilers, and I can really explain what did and didn't work for me.
Elphaba, they're coming for you. Just look at me.
Not with your eyes, with theirs.
The first place that I want to start is all of the setup for Dorothy's crew in The Wizard of Oz, because that is an element of Wicked Part 1 that I found so interesting. And watching the trailers, having seen the movie, so much of that is actually given away, which is one of the elements that I think the movie struggles to justify, specifically with Scarecrow. But with Bok and Nessa, those characters do really work. And then the Cowardly Lion, which is just a lion, is in the movie. It's Coleman Domingo. It's fun. Bok's evolution is really fascinating because that character from the get-go quite literally was somebody whose heart was on their sleeve. And his love for Galinda and the relationship that he sort of winds up in with Nessa is one that he is struggling to be a part of. And to see where that character is in Wicked for Good, I really liked, because that's somebody who has been so forward with his emotions, but at the same time has not been true to his heart because of his love for Galinda. And ultimately, him turning into the Tin Man was really scary. And having Nessa perform a spell after having such an unbridled moment of joy, being able to fly with the enchanted slippers, which were glowing red. It's a funny way of getting around the copyright of the MGM ruby slippers. And I like that that moment of her joy is completely undercut by Bok's betrayal and ultimately what he becomes as the Tin Man. I think that worked really, really well. Nessa turning into the Wicked Witch of, I don't remember which, it's either East or West. I'm going to say it's East. I've always had a hard time remembering which compass direction each person is. And that character's fall from grace, thinking she has achieved everything, and her perspective on being mad with Elphaba really does track. Their relationship has always been so up and down, but the movie, this is something I hate that they did do this, because it's used multiple times in the film, which is we see a flashback to a sequence where they were all having fun in a field. In my mind, canonically, it fits in after they went to the Osgood ballroom and everybody loved each other because they were dancing after Elphaba's demonstration of complete confidence in herself or lack thereof, and that's what bonded her and Galinda. We see this sequence multiple times. We had never seen it before, and for a movie to be about the origin of these relationships, to not have that moment, that really did frustrate me. Just as a, hey, here's this thing that happened that we happened to not show you. I thought that was kind of frustrating. But Nessa's witch origin, that did work for me. The one that didn't, and it quite frustrates me because I found this shocking with how For Good handles it, which is Fiero's introduction in Wicked Part 1 is of this guy who's sort of just living life and quite literally uses the word brainless in Dancing Through Life. It's one of my favorite songs from the album in total, Wicked Part 1, if we want to argue specifics. And that character's evolution just doesn't track with what we know about the Scarecrow. The Cowardly Lion wants to be brave. The Tin Man wants a heart, and the Scarecrow wants a brain. Which, that's what those characters want. It was written in the book, and it's in Wizard of Oz the movie. You have to fall in line with what we are aware of from the original source material. And Fiero's arc in this movie is the complete opposite of brainless. He's somebody who initially, and I thought this is where we were going to go with this, is falling in line with Galinda. He likes her. He wants her to be happy. He's willing to marry her. He's sort of looking for Elphaba, but he also permeates this water thing that she'll melt. And I like that that was part of the propaganda and how that falls in line with the movie later on. But he is not somebody who is functioning without a brain at all. The Scarecrow element totally fits. I love how the magic that Elphaba has done throughout the two movies never really fits in with what she wants to do. It's more a metaphor. It's symbolic. And Fiero's betrayal of the Wizard of Oz and everybody, and him being quite literally he would have been tied to the stockade or stocks and to be tortured so that way he would eventually give her up after falling in love with Galinda. And the moment between them is another example of, I think this song's okay, but Stephen Schwartz has written better falling in love songs, and this is just not one of them. Most of the music in Act 2 is not as good. I have never listened to this album outside of when it plays in the movie. I've listened to a couple of the songs afterwards. For Good is absolutely incredible. It is a banger of a song. And No Good Deed is also pretty good. But other than that, it's way too many reprises for me, which I think does help the movie feel like it takes so much longer to get started. And I completely lost my point. But Fiero getting turned into the Scarecrow so that way he would survive the torture that the wizard would put him through, that works. But it doesn't line up with what the Scarecrow wants and his entire relationship with Elphaba / the Wicked Witch of the pick a direction on the compass in the Wizard of Oz. This is one of those struggles where people may argue that this is really nitpicky, but the whole point of this story, and it is one of the things that I like the most, as I said in On Spoilers, is a lot of this is context and backstory for things we didn't know that were happening alongside the Wizard of Oz. So if that is to be believed, then he would never want anything bad to happen to her. That's just really frustrating for me in the way that tracks at all. An element that did really work for me, and I think this is especially compelling, wrapping up the whole two movies that are really about this ideology of propaganda and permeating hate towards one person in particular. And the fact that Galinda didn't have magic and it was all a ruse in order to have a good witch, which, pun intended, because Michelle Yeoh is actually capable of magic, but this whole idea that she is the symbol for good because you need to have a hero that is the enemy of the enemy you've created for society to hate. I think that was really fascinating, and it allows Ariana Grande's character to have a compelling arc. Somebody who has been given everything they've ever wanted, but ultimately, it's still not the thing that they want because of her relationship with Elphaba. The two of them work so well together, and whether the plot is sort of just happening to them, where it does sort of feel like we've got to shift our deck chairs so they're in the right positions, there just isn't a naturalistic way of moving these characters along. There definitely feels like we need them to get to certain points in order for this story to work. There are several amounts of logistics for me that just don't work within the story of The Wizard of Oz. I know this is something from the musical that we never see Dorothy because the story's not about her. And if that is a tradition based on the musical, I think it's really cool that we did stick with that. An element that I think is ridiculous, and it is something I predicted based on listening to and watching Wicked Part 1 several times, I was under the assumption that the Wizard of Oz was Elphaba's father. We see the bottle in the first one, and if you look at the soundtrack, it is Jeff Goldblum singing. So it's right there, and the hint is given away. This is another instance where soundtrack gave something away. Look up Star Wars The Phantom Menace because that soundtrack ruined that Qui-Gon Jinn died. And the execution of that character reveal after Elphaba, again, we're in spoilers, fakes her own death, doesn't feel like it has the weight that it should, because we know the wizard wants the broom as an indication that the witch is dead. It is a totem she created for flight when opening the Grimhold. However, there's no real time to explore what that means when it's in the last 5 minutes of the movie. Glinda uses it as blackmail, so he leaves. I don't understand why it was such a significant mystery for it sort of just to be shuffled to the side. And the same could be said for what they do with Michelle Yeoh's character. That's the part that really frustrates me more than anything, is the use of time in this movie just sometimes doesn't make any sense. There are certain parts of this story that I would have absolutely adored to have be more focus of the story. The Wizard of Oz stuff, when done well, is really interesting. The main cast, they're fantastic. Getting to see all of those interactions and what it means and how those relationships are challenged because of the propaganda of the Wicked Witch is really interesting. What wasn't was going to see the animals, which seems to be a plot that's essentially dropped. We get to see the Wicked Witch mess up the Golden Gate Bridge, the Yellow Brick Road, and that sort of happens, and she seems to be doing certain things, and then eventually, I like that she isn't fulfilling the role that society believes she is until she loses Nessa. That is a breaking point for Elphaba. People wanted the Wicked Witch. I'm gonna give them to her. I've lost Fiyero, at least she thinks she does. And that is really fascinating to me because the movie shows us him getting tied to the stalks and her performing a spell. So I was under the impression, well, yeah, he's the Scarecrow, only for one of the flying monkeys to hand a piece of his coat. But already in the movie, we've seen that the Scarecrow is wearing Fiyero's coat from being the lead of the Wizard of Oz's army. So I found that really fascinating that it kind of played fast and loose with, are people paying attention? And ultimately they're not. I do think all of the designs for the original cast of The Wizard of Oz were really, really good. Specifically the burlap sack texture that is on Fiyero's face, I think worked out really well. I do like the fact that it does turn out that she does not melt from water. It is not something that was established as an actual weakness, but only propaganda that Fiyero uses in order to have Elphaba fake her own death. And the fact that ultimately her and Fiyero leave and Galinda does believe them to be dead, it's quite tragic that these characters do have to move on from the life that they lived. And ultimately, Oz is hopefully better off without the wizard. He is a sleazy con man, and it winds up hopefully being this idealistic society that they always wanted it to be, which is interesting. And it ends on kind of just a, we hope things are better specifically with Galinda being able to open the Grimmery at the end of it. I don't want more of this universe. I think this is good enough that this story was told. I can understand why at the time this worked so well for so many people. It was a new perspective on a movie that I believe this was in Variety or Rolling Stone that people say is one of the movies most seen by humans ever. It's been on TV since the 40s, and it's one of the most beloved movies of all time. And I'm glad that it sounds like a lot of people absolutely adored getting to see this movie in the 2 parts that it was. I think overall it didn't work for me in its conclusion, but it's definitely a journey that I enjoyed being on. Now let's jump into listener mail and question of the week responses.
Can I ask you a question? Just one?
There's something I've been meaning to ask you.
I ask the questions, you answer the questions.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Did that count as a question?
Yes.
Damn it.
Before getting to last week's question of the week responses, I owe Jermaine Jones an apology because Jermaine wrote in and he said the Arnold remake I want is Commando or End of Days. Those are 2 standout films. I agree with that, Jermaine. I think it's funny that Commando was one of them, and I talked about all the other ones that were addressed in last 2 weeks ago's question of the week. Last week's question of the week was, what musical would you like to see be made into a movie? Dylan Pollock writes in, the very obvious answer is Hamilton, so I'll just leave it at that. As far as The Running Man, while it's certainly flawed, I think it's much better of an overall film than the Arnold version, although I understand perhaps less memorable since it's not quite as outlandish. I did really enjoy the theme, though if corporate ownership and how by the end is just realizing he and everyone else needs to stop participating. I thought the beginning did set up a dystopia well. I do agree it's the least Edgar Wright movie, but I still really enjoyed it and would recommend it. Legacy Odin writes in, golly, if only there was a version of Monty Python's Spamalot. A more serious answer, being the most musicals I'm familiar with have been and already adaptations, but Tick Tick Boom is my favorite adaptation of a musical. Legacy, I absolutely adore Tick Tick Boom, and it's a travesty that Andrew Garfield didn't win the Oscar. And then side note, love to hear this, the baby as well, she's getting more active, sleepily mostly at the right times, wiggling about. She's one lil happy baby. Legacy, I'm so happy to hear that. Congratulations to you and the fam. Scotty Cameron. A Broadway musical I'd like to see adapted is Hamilton. It could work as an American Revolution film stylized like Vice or The Big Short. I think its appropriate terms for like Running Man is a readaptation, where it's adapting a book or comic, trying to be more faithful to the original material. A good example would be the It films or Red Dragon in 2002, and bad examples like The Crow in 2024. Thank you to everybody who wrote in their question of the week responses. And we have a voice memo from Keen Machine. Let's get to that right now.
Greetings, Kyle. Keen Machine here, just popping in to give my thoughts on Wicked for Good, and I must say, I couldn't be happier. I have been anticipating this movie for a long time, and it did not disappoint. I think anyone who's familiar with Wicked will tell you that the second act is weaker than the first act. That's pretty much a consensus, but what makes the second act fun is that we get to have that synchronization of, okay, here's the timeline we all know about The Wizard of Oz, from the Dorothy perspective in the original film and book. And then we're coupling that now with the Wicked storyline and the characters that we've seen different perspectives of and the new characters that we've been introduced to. And we get to see how those characters interact with the storyline we already know and kind of what's going on behind the scenes as Dorothy's in Oz. And that's what makes it fun, right? I mean, some of the music isn't as good. I think No Good Deed is fantastic and was done really well. I think the finale song, of course, is incredible. And I really think everyone did a great job. Great sets, great special effects, great costume. Everything was fantastic. It was beautiful to watch. And even though it may not be quite as good as the first film, it's still really great. This message is already a minute long, so I'm going to stop talking now. But overall, a thumbs up for me. I loved it. Keep it keen.
Keen, I'm so glad you enjoyed it. And I think giving your perspective on being a fan of the musical on Broadway and then seeing that adapted, I can totally understand why a lot of those things would work. And I know a lot of my criticisms probably were considered to be too critical. As I said in non-spoilers, I am really looking forward to reevaluating it as one entire piece, as an act one, and an Act 2 as opposed to two separate films, or even a Part 1 and a Part 2, but who knows when I will get to that. I would like it to be sooner rather than later, but thank you so much for submitting your voice note. I really appreciate that and keeping it keen. This week's question of the week is simple. What is your favorite Netflix series? To answer, you can comment below on Anchor/Spotify and YouTube. You can email the podcast, filmreelistspod@gmail.com, or @filmreelist on any of the social medias. Just make sure to include the hashtag QOTW. If you haven't yet, please subscribe on your preferred podcast platform as well as YouTube. That would be absolutely incredible. It would be awesome to hit the first monetization level before getting into 2026. I have a lot of exciting stuff planned that I can't announce yet, so I'm really hoping that 2026 is another year of growth for the Film Realist, and I can only do that because of amazing listeners. You listening right now, thank you so much for wanting to hear my opinion on Wicked for Good. It's amazing, and something I can announce that I'm really excited about. With US Thanksgiving coming up, that means there's more movies, and this is not the only Film Realist episode this week. Wednesday, when you wake up, there will be a Zootopia 2 review. So there's 2 reviews this week. I know I said I wouldn't do that again on US Thanksgiving, but the kids and I really wanted to see the film, and I wanted to share my opinion, because if you are a longtime listener, you know how much well-made animated projects are something I care about. So I'm going to be reviewing 2 movies this week, Wicked for Good, as well as Zootopia 2. That will be out Wednesday morning, so you can look forward to that. And then next week will be my Stranger Things Volume 1 in Season 5 review. So thank you so much for listening. My name is Kyle Naranya, and I will see you next time.